Well, welcome to another uh, YouTube and Hangout by the Taylor Family Association. I would uh, title this one today Gathering and Saving Sources from Old Path and Family Group Sheets. We're going to talk about the issues that are involved and some suggestions about how you can gather the information from these files before they are discarded, uh, that you gather all the critical information that can be used for sourcing a document or to gather additional research. So let's begin, Ron. Let's first of all talk about what we think about as a real source when we're talking about sources that we would want to put on legacy in the legacy database.
Okay. Well, yeah, we need to define what a real source is, or better,
Good source.
what a good source is. Okay, so when you're talking about a genealogy source, the most important thing in a genealogy source is that that someone else can actually find that source based on what you have recorded. So if your source is very cryptic and nobody can find the actual source, that's not a very good source. So a good source is one that somebody can easily find the same source that you are documenting.
Okay. With that, let's talk for a few minutes then about sources coming out of path files. And we have, as a part of the Taylor Family Association database, a lot of information that was gathered early from path files. So let's talk a little bit about what's in those path files in the way of sources and where people can find them, and then what we need to do about them. Because they are, in fact, generally collected in one spot, right?
Yeah, we're still getting cut out. Your sound is still cutting in and out, but we'll try to work with it. Okay, so the main thing that we're finding in some of the older records, especially those that were collected by people into path files, is they would record things such as, I visited the cemetery today and found tombstones for these people. So if you look at that later, you're wondering, who is the I, and what cemetery did they visit, and whose tombstones did they see, and what was on those tombstones? None of that is clear from what they thought they recorded as a source. Another really good example would be, I visited with my grandmother this afternoon, and she told me that my cousin was married. We have no idea from that. That's not a source. It doesn't tell me who visited which grandmother, at what point in time, and which cousin was married to who. We have no idea what any of those things refer to. So those are poor sources. It doesn't do any good to record things like that.
Okay, so so the answer to that solution is that rather than the pronoun, we need to get a personal name and maybe even the date that the event, in the case of an interview, that it actually occurred, right?
Correct. Yeah, we want clear names instead of pronouns, and we want the time frame that these events happened.
Okay.
That would really help. Yep.
So that would be one thing that exists in those notes. The other thing that we find is we have sources that are listed that may be categorized as partial sources. But let me give an example for my records. I would I've seen, for example, some LDS ordinances that show as a reference the ward, like for example, the Far West Ward records. And it may have a book number, not a complete source. I have also seen the same thing with Far West Ward records, the book number, and then the file actual number that a person could actually get to. A good source, but of course, this is dealing with a specific event in the life of a person. So it needs to be transferred and associated with that event that is listed in the legacy family tree.
Yeah, those are really good examples. In fact, some of these sources that people have cited in the past are now available on Family Search that they can look at on their screen anywhere in the world. So instead of having to travel to Far West and look at that record, they could pull it up on their screen if they had the correct identification of that source, or what we call the Universal Record Locator. That's the URL for that source on the internet. They can type that into their search engine and it'll pull up that exact record on screen, and then they can cite it that way. So anytime we have an old source like Far West records that have been computerized and they're available on the internet, we should also try to include the modern internet link to that source.
Okay. Now there may be other information in those PAF notes that ought to be maybe put into other places in Legacy for further work. Like, for example, a person may make a note or comment about further research that needs to be done. You know, this is my opinion, but we really need to find this a birth date or a place or something that they have left, you know, where they had at the time they created the record, but they actually given you suggestions about additional research.
Yeah, those are really good examples of research notes, not necessarily sources, and the research note might say something like, I need to find this birth certificate. Hopefully that's connected to a specific person. And again, the I is a pronoun. We don't have any idea who put that note in there. So we need to know who said we need to find a birth certificate, and we need to make sure that it's clear which birth certificate we're looking for. Now, if that person would have been more specific, they might have said, I need to look in the Weber County records for this birth certificate, or whatever they thought. Maybe it was somebody that moved from Germany to New York. They might say, I know this person came from Germany, so we need to look in Germany for the birth certificate. Or maybe even more clear than that, I need to look at Berlin, whatever.
Let's talk for a minute about slicers and this same problem.
Okay.
A slicer may, in working with their cousins, may find that a cousin has collected a lot of information in a PAF file, and they're sending it to them to be integrated into their slice of the legacy family tree that they're working on. So
right.
They get this PAF file. They can load it, what we recommend separately, to do some cleanup. And one of those things that they would want to look at is these notes. Some of these things that we just talked about could definitely apply. Here you have cousin so-and-so making a few comments about some of the information that they've collected, which, knowing who has sent the information, they can change the pronoun to the particular person or give the person a call and say, was this you that we're talking here about this a note that you made that was in the file, or where did you collect this from, so that we can get to the I or the pronoun in the notes.
Yeah, that's going to be a real challenge on some of them, and if they can figure out those pronoun antecedents, then they should definitely put those in there. If they can't, they might need to make reference. They might need to make a clear that they can't figure out who the pronouns refer to.
Yeah.
Because it won't. If they can't figure it out, nobody else may be able to figure it out either.
True. Well, let's go on and talk a little bit about now. Is there anything else we need before we leave the FAF subject? Is there anything else you think about that we need to address with regard to these things? Well, I guess we ought to talk about the fact that some PATH sources refer to the whole family group sheet, and other PATH sources may refer to a particular event, correct? They need to be separate. They need to be separated, right?
Yeah, or you can create one source. If you have a source that pertains to everybody on a certain group sheet, the best way to do that type of a source is connect it to the marriage of the parents. And that way it will refer to everybody in that family. Another way to do it would be to attach the same source to everybody on that group sheet, but that becomes really redundant. It'd be easier just to put it on the marriage.
Okay. All right. Well, let's turn our attention then to the old family group records.
Okay.
We're very concerned about capturing all of the information that is on the bottom or on the far right of the end, in some cases in the back of those family group records before they go into garbage, or we consider destroying them in any way. So we need to have people working with their cousins examine those old family group records to glean all the information that they can from those things. It's like looking at an obituary. There's maybe a lot of additional source or clues about the family that exists scattered around those record forms. Let's talk first of all about on the old forms, they had the originator who had created the form in the first place, and that, of course, can get lost as the information is added to the file. So that needs to be captured. Let's talk. Let me give you an example. Jesse Warner was a great genealogist in the LDS Church and related to the Taylors, and did a great deal of work on the Taylor line. We have many family group sheets that bear his name. Let's talk about how we would document the fact that this family group sheet was created originally by Jesse Warner.
Yeah, that Jesse did make very good sources on most of his group sheets. Even some of those need to be straightened out as far as identifying the pronouns and stuff. But yeah, those things can all be separated onto actual sources instead of just notes. We don't want all that data just thrown into one big notes section. We want them to make actual sources that a source refers to a certain event. I think we forgot to define that up front. What we have is there's two different things, and a lot of these genealogists confuse the two. We have events, which are things that happened. Then we have sources that prove that the event happened.
Okay.
It's pretty simple. Once you look at it that way, then you go, oh, okay.
Yes. Well, now, and Jesse's work had a lot of information with very old sources on it. So we would need to maybe put some of that information in the research section, documenting the chronology of research associated with that person and Jesse Warner's name to begin. The other part, there's a couple of other things now as you look beyond just the name of who the person did it. We mentioned that Jesse had done some great work with regard to sourcing, like the book, page, and so forth in the book, which is very good. In other cases, however, the source would be what I would consider a partial source. We have maybe the title of a book or a document, but it isn't definitive enough to meet the criteria of the definition that we began this presentation with. You can't really find, without doing some digging and personal research yourself, the information which they were alluding to. So that's what I would call a partial source. But we need to capture that as we're going forward so that we don't lose the information that started the verification of the event or the person that's on the page, right?
Right.
So we need to come up with, and I guess we haven't talked about it, but some indicator that says that as we put a source in, that the source is in fact a partial source, so that you can get back at it again as you come back to that person and you're looking at the sources. They can be seen. I don't know if we put a Tyndall on it or some other item on the source or in a source field, so that they can quickly sort out those sources which we would consider partial or incomplete. What's your thoughts, Ron?
Well, not only that, but one other thing just occurred to me. As we have these people verifying the sources, we should also include their names, saying something to the effect, for example, you might say Gordon Taylor verified this source on this date, and or Gordon Taylor tried to find this source and could not find it on this date. So in other words, you had an old source that somebody thought they made, but nobody can find it anymore.
Okay. And those could be, for example, a Bible that someone alluded to and has now maybe actually been destroyed, or no one knows in whose hands the Bible still resides.
That's right. And maybe the Bible still exists, but nobody has a clue where it's at anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are the kind of things that are interesting. So you could say this source, I cannot verify this source because the artifact or whatever it is no longer locatable. If anybody finds this thing, let us know where it is.
Okay. All right. Are there other things as you think about a family group sheet there, Ron, that we maybe ought to highlight that they would consider?
Yeah, I was earlier, before we started our broadcast, I was talking about lineage or relationship information. Those lineages and relationship information should not be in the notes. For example, a lot of our old notes will say something like the parents are, and it gives the names of the parents, or the spouse is. Those things don't belong in the notes. They belong in the actual database structure. So if you know the name of a spouse, add the spouse to the database. Or the name of the parents, you put the parents in the database. You don't just stick it in the notes. That way it eliminates redundancy. So the actual structure of the database makes it so that each person is only in the database once. They're not once in the database, once in a note here, once in a note there, and so forth. So if you end up fixing a parent's name or a spouse's name, you only fix it in one place and it's done.
You're right.
Yeah.
And that's a good point. Now, as you're doing this, we've talked about a little process that maybe you could use, that as you're working through path notes for a file that you've received, that you maybe put a little Tyndall mark, that little mark is up there in the left-hand corner of your computer tablet there with the keyboard, on the item as you finish moving it. You may want to leave it in notes for a while until you finish working through the complete note, but that way, if you're working with the note, you can maybe work one or two items, maybe one item, move appropriate information into various places, put a Tyndall mark on it, and so when you come back to work on it again, you say, oh yeah, I've done that one, this is the next one, so that there's some indication as you make your progress through a file that you can see what you've done and what needs to be done. Later on, if you feel comfortable having moved all of the relevant information, and there may truly be a few things that you'll want to leave in the notes, you maybe will go in and delete the notes. But by us using this as convention, as the association, we can see what you're doing, and we can, as you're updating the files, and you can also see what you're doing as you have time to work through the various things. I would definitely recommend, as you pick up files from cousins, the path files, for example, and you look at them, you can see what work needs to be done, and you may want to load it to the Taylor Family Association without completing all of the moving these notes around, but you put it on your to-do list for a quiet day that you can step in and work on some of the things which we have discussed today. Any other thoughts, Ron, before we conclude this discussion?
No, just the basic principle that we currently have way too much information that's just been thrown into general notes that needs to be broken out into proper events and sources. So that's our long-term goal. Might be hard to get there, but we got to start somewhere. And the better we accomplish that task, the easier that everyone else will be able to follow our work.
Right. So as we add in new information about new births, marriages, and other events, and we add those sources, if we could follow these principles and conventions, that makes it much easier for the next generation or the next person to pick up the file to use. Correct? Yeah,
there's some fun things. Watch for mistakes that were made in the past. I helped this lady at our family history class this last week. She had a child from a family, the name was Laureen, and she found a tombstone that showed that the child died at about 12 months old. And the tombstone was right next to another tombstone for her sister that died at about 6 months old. And both tombstones looked exactly alike, so we knew they came from the same family, and they were right next to each other. And we were quite certain that the family knew that they died and they were buried there. But that was in 1885. On the 1900 census, we found Lorraine listed with the family, and with no explanation. This didn't make any sense. She was there on the family, but we knew she died in 1883 or 1882. Very strange. The only thing we could figure out is that the census taker most likely asked the parents, how many children did you have? And he wrote that down. And what were their names? And he started writing that down. And what was their ages and so forth. But he forgot to go back and cross off Lorraine because she was dead. And that's the only thing we can figure out. Like, he did not list the second sister, which is, her name was Pearl. She was not listed. So they must have caught the mistake somewhere between writing down Lorraine and writing down Pearl. So kind of an interesting problem, because usually you assume that a census tells you of people that are currently living. But in this family's case, it was a list of family members, and then they forgot to delete the ones that were dead.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty funny.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ron, and we hope that this is useful to you. If you have any questions, you're certainly free to email both either Ron at doitforron@gmail.com or to Gordon at gmtmt8@gmail.com. And we will be happy to continue the conversation with you about gathering sources from old PATH files and from family group sheets. Don't throw those family group sheets away until you've gathered all the information off of it, both front and back. Until next time, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.